I think about how that world would feel if she had been intentionally included instead of accidentally excluded.
Hello, and welcome back to the Accessible Future podcast. My name is Simon Jones, and I'm very excited to have you today. Today's episode, we get to sit down with Kelly Thibodeau. Kelly is the founder and principal of Squarely Accessible. It's an organization who's focused on digital accessibility. She has been in marketing and communications for 25 plus years. And since 2007, she has been pushing to make sure that accessibility is part of how that work gets done, not an afterthought or a compliance checkbox. Kelly's mum had a neurological condition called OPCA. She talks about growing up in a household with someone who had a disability. She asked the question, what it would have been like if her mum was intentionally included versus accidentally excluded. I think you'll really enjoy this one. Here's my interview with Kelly Thibodeau. Good afternoon, Kelly, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
How's your day been going so far?
Great. Yeah, it's got a few projects on the go. Something my daughter's getting married in June, so lots of
Oh, wow.
things getting excited about.
So, obviously, this podcast, as you know, is about what an accessible future looks like. But before we get going, I was noticing something on your website
Mm.
that you mentioned that content can't be conversational until it's inclusive. So, could you elaborate a little bit on
Sure.
that for us?
Yeah. So my background is in communications and social media strategy. And, I think about particularly online spaces, and that really the whole purpose of the information that we put online is to drive conversation. So whether that's with staff or customers or shareholders or board or audience, the whole point of it is to create conversation, get
Mhm.
feedback from other people, and learn and create a loop. And if it's not an inclusive conversation, if it doesn't consider different perspectives and experiences, then it's a pretty narrow point of view. So, in sort of looking at my own journey around access and inclusion and what that means for both me personally and for Squarely Accessible, it really is about creating that conversation online in different spaces. So.
So, leading on from that, then, what would you say then an accessible future looks like to you?
Mm. Well, I mean, I particularly think of online spaces and, being part of our modern society today. There's not too many things that you can't do without going online in one way, shape, or
Right.
form. So when I think about an inclusive and accessible future, it means that everybody can participate in a way that works for them
Mhm.
in those online spaces and experiences, whether that's something as simple as scrolling Instagram to catch up with your friends, or applying for a job or filing your taxes and things like that.
Yeah. So, do you have any examples then? You mentioned about a screen reader, but do you have any other examples of what barriers need to be removed to get that accessible future?
Absolutely. I mean, starting with plain language,
Yeah.
content that's easy to read, structured well, links that make sense. Certainly, folks who use screen readers, but then also people who are just busy and distracted in the world. And, we've worked so hard to get people's attention. So it's about coming back to who is in the audience and making sure that we're connecting with people and not just limiting the idea of what does accessibility mean to assistive technology. And I keep coming back to, we're not testing the assistive technology, we're testing usability of people's experiences online.
Okay, Kelly. So you have a bit of a personal story that I
Mhm.
wanted to ask you. I understand you had some experience with your mother. So could you kind of tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, my mom had a neurological condition called olivopontocerebellar ataxia, or OPCA.
Yeah.
And it's a rare condition that my mom started to develop around the age of 35. And we really didn't know what was going on. So my dad would tell me that symptoms looked something like smoked too many cigarettes and drank too much coffee, some differences with her, the way that she walked and the way that she spoke. And it wasn't until I was a teenager that we found out that that was my mom's diagnosis. It's still a fairly general thing because there are specific types
Hmm.
of that, and my mom's blood never tested positive for that. But it meant that over time, She experienced a decline in her health. She ended up, going into assisted living and then eventually into a full nursing home. And it was a part of my life that I didn't really talk about a lot
Mm-hmm.
because I felt like it was just something that I didn't really know how to articulate. So now in really turning my focus to accessibility and inclusion, I realized, I mean, there was always a backdrop of inclusion in my life, but I didn't necessarily make that as forward facing in my work. Bringing those 2 things together, at first, when I told my mom's story, it made me really nervous and I felt unsure. I always felt emotional. My mom passed away in 2017, and so but now it really brings that full circle moment because I love to remind people that accessibility is personal, and especially when I think about both the corporate environments that I worked in marketing communications, and I know what other people are faced with, it's always like the next big flashy campaign or how are we gonna, improve our search engine rank and that type of thing. So it starts to depersonalize the
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
And so I like to remind people through sharing my mom's story that I'm likely not the only one who knows or loves someone who has a
Yeah.
disability. So, again, to sort of reflect and remember that this is about humans and about bringing people in. So, it's sort of like a bit of a windy answer to your
Yeah.
question,
Yeah.
but that's how, in my personal life, it's extremely relevant to the work that I do.
Yeah. That's a incredible story. So thank you for sharing that. So is there a moment that really stayed with you through that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when before my mom's health really started to affect her every day, she would, it was in the days of playing solitaire online and email, and certainly like smartphones weren't a thing or anything like that. But as her needs changed, that took more and more of a backdrop, right? And so I think about how that world would feel if she had been intentionally included instead of accidentally excluded.
So then would you say, Kelly, that that experience you went through with your mother has really sort of shaped your business of Squarely Accessible?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the name Squarely Accessible and the brand Squarely Accessible sort of came around in about the 2023 time, because I had always accessibility was always part of my work. I started
Mm.
working in 2007 as part of sort of a corporate working group. It was never my job title, but it was something I cared about, and I kept trying to fit it into all these different containers, and so I wanted to create my own container and also have a really differentiated view of what does accessibility mean, particularly for content creators, like I say, marketing communications. More broadly than that, I want people to make it part of what they do every day because they're not waiting for someone to complain. It becomes part of the way the work gets done.
So in your professional work, you started as a technical writer?
Yes, actually, I started my career as a technical writer, and then from there, sort of worked into web content, usability, again in sort of marketing communications. But I'm always fascinated about how people use things online, so where those friction points are, and then how to reduce, and in this case, in reducing those barriers.
So then the path you took with technical writing, how did that lead you to the path of accessibility and consulting?
Oh, that's interesting. So I think it's more that mindset of helping people get things done. So in
Yeah.
technical writing, right, I was writing help content for software platforms. And, often it would come down to the technical writing would be like sort of the last stop before something gets shipped out the door. But it's really hard to write, say, a procedure about how to do XYZ on a software platform if you don't understand the problem and the circumstance. So, I've always been a bit of, like, a nerd, analytical kinda stuff. That's how
Mhm.
my personality tends to type, and so I think that sort of big picture thinking, but also needing to understand what's happening underneath, those dots do start to weave together,
Yeah.
and, again, like, a real passion for just making people feel included eventually wound its way into accessibility. I don't know if that story makes sense, but it's what the path that I can kind of put a bit of a timeline to.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I understand that you're the founder and principal of Squarely Accessible.
Mhm.
So tell us a bit about Squarely Accessible.
Sure. Yeah. So at Squarely Accessible, we help people make accessibility part of what they do every day. Sometimes that might look at taking an assessment of where are some high impact tools and communications, and then having people with disabilities review those materials. We also do some automated testing, and then we really want to help organizations build capacity internally. So what that means is sort of leaning in to understand what do people need? How do we help them build their confidence, build their knowledge, and start to get excited about creating a more inclusive experience for people? And sometimes there's organizations that kind of feel like they've quote unquote got it right in terms of having a bit of an internal group that takes care of public facing things like websites or things like that, but then they don't have the ability to scale that knowledge across the
Mhm.
organization.
Mhm.
So then we would come in and help with those types of things. So
So what type of organizations would you typically work with?
honestly, there isn't a typical, like, sector. I think
Mhm.
it's when there's values alignment around inclusion and belonging. Certainly legislation, like the
Yep.
Accessibility for Manitobans Act, helps to open those doors, or in some cases, Americans with Disabilities Acts. Again, legislation gets some budget item usually, it gets some attention, but I like to say that legislation is the start, it's not the
Yeah.
finish,
Yeah.
because we know that as an example, it's about creating that usable, inclusive experience that brings people in, that when companies are working really hard right now to connect with people based on those shared values,
Mhm.
that it's actually reflected in those front door places. Um, and it brings that experience together. You're not saying one thing and doing another, you're actually creating a unified experience there.
Yeah. So then, do you usually work with organizations that want to have an accessibility versus organizations that have to have an accessibility?
That's a really interesting question that you're asking me because I've thought about that so many times of like, do you want it or do you need it? Because if you need it, I'm not sure that that's really like the best place to
Yeah.
say job done, full stop. But if you want it, that means that you're willing to think differently about
Yeah.
what's actually happening here, who can be here, who sees themselves here, and how do we help them feel more included? So it's very interesting that you ask it to me that way because that's definitely been something I've reflected on.
So then, if someone comes to you that is sort of quote unquote just needing to tick the boxes,
Mhm.
what do you do? Like what do you say to them?
Well, part of it, I mean, it does always come down to a budget question at the end of it. And one of the other philosophies that we come back to a lot is small starts are better than not starting at all, and that practice makes permanent.
Hmm.
So, meaning that take those small steps, but build out maybe the roadmap of where do you ideally want to go. And if you need to phase that out in different parts of work, that's reasonable, right? Like do something, start inviting people in, have an accessibility policy on your website, give people even in, like, stock photos,
Yeah.
look for authentic representation of people with disabilities, work with people with disabilities. Don't just sort of stop at that automated, "Yes, we've met the guidelines," and I totally understand that people wanna check that box and get to that 100% done, but there really isn't
Yeah.
that. It doesn't exist because just like we're 2 different people, we do things in 2 different ways,
Yeah.
it's the same experience, right, for people that whether they have a disability or they're, going about their day and need to wanna experience content
Hmm.
in a different way. One thing that I think about all the time is just, like, subtitles and captions on video.
Yeah.
I could be sitting in a restaurant waiting for a friend for lunch, and I'm not gonna turn my audio on, I'd rather experience that with captions, just like someone who is deaf or hard of hearing would rely on those captions to understand video
Yeah.
content. So, it's not always an easy conversation, but I do like to think about where can we start to, like, build new
Hmm.
habits and then keep going? Because
Yeah.
I think people feel pressure to get it all right, quote unquote, "all right and perfect" before they start, but I wanna encourage people to just start and then keep going from there.
So then, would you say, Kelly, that the outcomes are different then from those that want to and those that are just ticking the box?
Yes. I think that examples that I think about are, if you're just looking to comply with legislation, there are so many things that legislation doesn't cover. So often, it's the web content accessibility guidelines that are cited in legislation, but there are real gaps for people with cognitive
Hmm.
differences, and that's starting to get worked on. But I think if one of the things that I have also heard that I love is, like, if you look at the rules, you forget the people because you're so focused on, "Did I meet the rule?" that you forget about the person at the other end of that. So, that would be the difference between want and need.
Yeah.
If you need it, then the rules are where you start and then where you finish. But if you want it, you bring people in.
Where is the best place for an organization wanting to start on this journey?
So there's bottom up and top down, right?
Yep.
Meaning, like, you can have some folks at a grassroots level that care deeply, maybe for personal reasons or because they see that, accessibility does support real business drivers. It's not just
Hmm.
about the right thing to do. Of course, it's the right thing to do. It's not just an HR or a DEI play. This is going to help you gain market share, improve, like, attract more customers, reduce customer churn, attract more employees, improve retention, like those real hard, tangible business goals. So, if we isolate accessibility to one specialized group within the organization, then it sort of feels like, oh, well, then that's their job, right? And even in something like a web team, often it comes down to, like, oh, that's technical stuff that the web developer will figure
Yep.
out, but
Yep.
I don't really have to pay attention to that. And that's a lie because accessibility is everyone's
Yep.
job.
Yep.
So, again, the start is the start. But I've also talked with other organizations that have said, like, fully said to me, like, "We get it, but our compliance department hasn't told us that we have to yet. So I just can't prioritize it right now." Right? So, like, the reality of that definitely is something that I've heard of, and I am a bit of a dreamer in thinking that everybody should be jumping on board, but at the same time, it's, I think, just a lack of awareness, and people think that maybe it's deprioritized because, again, we get back to this mindset of, why am I doing so much work for so few people?
Yeah.
And that's a really limited view.
Yeah. I come back to what you're saying about, you're getting it out there, and that's what this podcast is all about.
Mhm.
Is actually making people aware of, okay, we don't have to just tick those boxes. We can actually build an
Yeah.
accessible world. So, for any organizations that want to start with accessibility, do you have any courses or conferences that you can recommend?
For sure. Yeah, Squarely Accessible, one of the things that we do is we develop we have courses that people can sign up for. So, we have accessible Word documents, accessible websites, social media, PDFs, and PowerPoints. They're all separate classes, and I'm really proud of that work. I'm passionate about, again, like, getting more people doing the work. We need more people doing the work and feeling confident about that. And so training is one way to do that, but what we're really invested in is the change that comes
Yeah.
as a result of that. So we do those publicly. We also do them internally for different organizations that, again, want to offer something to their staff that's a little different. Um, we believe in bringing the learning in so that people get to practice and do those things as part of it. It's not just watch somebody for a couple hours and then go find the time to do it later. We bring that in as part of the learning experience.
So you mentioned just now that some of the courses are in like Word and PDF. So
Mhm.
can you dive a little bit more into actually like what are some things you would learn in those
Sure.
courses?
Well, it's interesting because this may be the connection of where my technical writing background comes in. So, when I first started working for a small technical writing company in Vancouver, one of my jobs was formatting Word documents. We would do policy and procedure manuals for different types of organizations. And so, what I learned are some of the maybe more advanced features
Mhm.
that make them easier to maintain, as it turns out, make them more accessible as well. So, uh, we use, again, like, things like styles, heading structure, the way the links come together, alt text for images, right? Like, Microsoft tools come with a built-in accessibility checker, which is great, but there are also some things that that checker is not going to catch. So just because you got that green check mark in Word doesn't mean that that document is actually accessible. And then once you convert it to a PDF, there's a little bit more work to happen there. So, um, It's surprising to me how many organizations that I do feel like are really values-led, when I go and look at, like, their annual reports and things like that, haven't taken the time to make sure that the PDF is structured properly, that it's accessible, all those things.
So there's a stat that 80% of disabilities are invisible. Knowing that, how should organizations think about their audience?
Well, we're really conditioned in our society to be able to think that we can see some kind of visual evidence of disability. And I think about signs like for accessible washrooms or accessible parking, right? And it's usually someone in a wheelchair. Um, but we know that 80% of disabilities are invisible, meaning you can't see them from the outside,
Mhm.
but they affect someone's experience or ability in life. So things like even someone who's deaf, you may not be able to tell, right? Or someone with autism or ADHD or cancer, arthritis, diabetes. And maybe you're just like not feeling great from day to day kind of thing, right? Or you don't know where people are at in their health journeys. And the other thing I think is really important is that we don't ask people to disclose personal health information.
Yep.
We don't wait for whether that's an accommodation request or a complaint. We don't wait for that to be the reason why we care about accessibility, that definition of done, that as professionals who put out content in the world, the definition of done is it accessible, right? Like, have I
Yeah.
done my own due diligence to make sure that it's accessible? I wouldn't release content that didn't follow brand guidelines as an example. I wouldn't release content that didn't sound like I wasn't following like the in-house style guide. So then why would I release something that I know is creating barriers for people?
Yeah. That's interesting. So then and I think it's your website that mentions this, people with disabilities have 13 trillion spending power
Mhm. Mhm.
versus 6.9 lost annually. So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about what that is.
Well, again, it's that real business driver around accessibility. Another stat is that like 75% of consumers with disabilities will shop elsewhere for a more expensive brand if they encounter barriers, right? Like if you could go to someone's website, put what you wanted to buy in the cart and you can't check it out, you're just going to go to somebody
Yeah.
else, right? And so that those $2 figures that you just referenced is when you think about not just people with disabilities, but also their extended networks, so their friends, their family, their caregivers, that's where the 13 trillion comes from, like trillion with a T. Like that's an
That's a lot of
incredible.
money.
Yeah. Yeah. That's incredible. And 16% of people around the world identify as having a disability. That's 1.3 billion people, like billion with a B.
Hmm.
In Canada, it's 27% of our population. So people with disabilities are already in our audience,
Yeah.
right? I think we sort of kid ourselves to think that, oh, if I want to make it accessible, then I can get to that audience that I'm not currently engaged with. Uh, but they're actually already there. So you have a real opportunity to surprise and delight people who are used to experiencing barriers every single day.
So then what can you tell us about digital accessibility?
Well, often with accessibility, people think about physical spaces, right?
Hmm.
Like we think about ramps or we think about elevators or things like that. And it's just as important that in our digital world that people can participate in a way that works for them. It's really hard to be like that person who's fully unplugged and
Yeah.
doesn't ever do anything online. Even if you yeah, whatever little thing it is, the days of sort of shopping around your resume, walking around and handing around paper are kind of done.
Hmm.
So you got to apply for jobs online, things like that. And like I say, even just sort of keeping up with what's going on, right? Like whether that's catching up with news or, friends and family, it's woven into our social fabric. So with digital, it's important that it is as accessible as we work to make the physical environment, that the digital is accessible as well.
Yeah. So we want to switch gears a little bit and talk about your time with, is it Level It Up?
Yeah, so Level It Up is a nonprofit here in Manitoba that helps people on the autism spectrum find meaningful work. So both like science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And we also help employers create workplaces that work for people on the autism spectrum. So both sides of it, right? Like Usually people who are in post-secondary or have completed some post-secondary and then are looking for work. So we have a course that people can take to help them learn about whether that's resume, interview, those types of skills. And then on the employer side, we've partnered with an organization called Specialisterna in Canada and created a community of practice so that employers can get together once a month. We have different themes and talk to each other about what's working, share some ideas, and creating more neuro-inclusive workspaces.
So, for anyone listening, and how do they find out about Level It Up?
Yeah, so it's just on our website. It is levelitup.mb.ca. We also really encourage people to donate to Level It Up to help us continue to do the work.
And then just go to the donate page on there.
Yes, yep, there's a donate page up there.
So you say you're on the board? Is that,
Yes, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So what inspired you to get on the board?
We'll certainly work around accessibility.
Yeah.
And then one of the people that is on my team is also on the board. She knew that there was an opening and they needed someone who had more of a marketing skill set. So invited me into that. My nephew has autism as well. And so again, like another thing that's so personally motivating
Mm-hmm.
for me to be part of that work. And yeah, that's been the way it's sort of evolved ever since over the last maybe 3 years or so.
That's great. So there's a stat that says in Canada, 33% of adults with autism are employed, and 80% of adults without autism are employed. So what barrier exists that causes such a large gap?
There's probably not one simple single answer to that, but when I think about certainly changes in technology as far as resumes and screening, so the automated technology, I think ATS is the acronym, not an HR, so don't quote me. But that sort of just scan resumes with, again, with the robots and don't really look for anything beyond that initial scan can be a barrier for folks. I think traditional interview
Mm-hmm.
processes, the ability to carry on small talk. Not everybody is great at that. And so, if that's going to be one of the criteria of how you decide whether a candidate is worth bringing into the organization, there might need to be just some alternate ways to engage with people. Maybe there's sort of a written component or something that is more of a personal, conversation, sort of reducing the pressure. So, sharing interview questions ahead of time to help people prepare and be successful in that interview and have it feel less of a test. And then once onboarding happens, making sure that sort of teams are aware, managers are aware, and it might be as simple as like dimming some lighting or moving a desk to a different place. It doesn't have to be that big of a deal. But, one thing that I think about with my nephew is he was unable to complete high school because he really struggled in English, and there wasn't a different way for him to get that credit. And so he's an incredibly intelligent person who can't get into post-secondary because he's unable to complete that high school. And so he's not working in a place that really takes advantage of his intelligence and talents and instead is forced into different types of work that again just haven't had a real resonance with who he is. So, I don't know all the answers to that question,
Hmm.
but those are some of the things that come up to mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So would you say then that there's like sort of mismatch with maybe hiring processes or
Mhm.
culture,
Yep.
that type of thing?
Yep. Yep, absolutely. And I think, we know that more and more adults are getting diagnosed later in life as
Yeah.
well. So, it's tough for people. I was talking to an employer just the other day who has their first employee resource group around neurodivergence and where people express that they could finally like take off the it's called masking if, someone's trying to sort of present as we'll say neurotypical but feeling like in order to do that, they have to hide part of themselves or not say something or look a certain way or things like that. So to be able to just sort of let that go and talk to people who get you, who
Hmm.
understand you, and then support within building that culture of more awareness. That's really important work that's happening within organizations. We're probably not where we could and should be, but it's a start, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So before we go, Is there one thing for anyone listening in today that they should understand about building a digital accessible future?
Yeah, I think again, that reality of folks with disabilities are already in your audience, and everything that you do to improve accessibility improves usability, improves search engine optimization. Like, there are so many connected benefits, and accessibility really is everyone's job. If you have people at the grassroots level that care deeply, but no accountability to leaders and nothing changes in your processes, then you're only going to get so far. You're going to burn those people out and they're going to leave. And then along with the expertise, right? So it really is about creating culture change within organizations, matching those values from the inside to what people see as your front doors on the outside, right? We sort of judge companies by their websites or social media. What is it that they're saying? Those types of things. And for content creators, particularly, to really embrace that they're not responsible for every aspect of accessibility, but there is a role to play. There is a leadership space and incredible opportunities for people to really make that difference so that we reduce barriers and we don't just wait for people to complain. We actually change the way work gets done.
Yeah. So where can people find you?
Squarelyaccessible.com would be one spot for sure. LinkedIn being my favorite social media platform of choice.
Yeah.
We do have a team of folks at Squarely Accessible that are awesome, talented people that we all love to just, again, really change how people are thinking and working. I'm pretty findable online in a lot of different places. So, if Google is the default, that would be a space. I'm not sure how I show up in AI search, but I'd definitely point people back to the website.
Excellent. Is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I think, again, I just come back to this idea of accessibility is personal.
Yeah.
Um, to remember the people in the story, encourage people to work with people with disabilities. There is a philosophy of nothing about us without us, which means don't just do the work and call it done. Actually bring people into the conversation, and don't forget that this really is about people. It's not just about the rules.
Well, thank you so much for joining today and sharing your story, Kelly. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Well, what a great episode that was. One thing that really stood out to me was that 80% of disabilities are invisible, and you never really know what someone else is experiencing. And that's the main argument for building accessibility from the start. You're not designing for a group that you can visually identify. You're designing the world as accessible for everyone because you never know who might need it. Everything that Kelly mentioned, her LinkedIn, Squarely Accessible website, Level It Up, will be found in the show notes. If you're enjoying the Accessible Future podcast, subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your favorite shows. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. We'll see you on the next episode.